Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome to Resiliency Matters. Today, we're speaking with Dr. Robert Brooks, a longtime educator, including part-time faculty at Harvard Medical School. He is the author or co-author of 19 books, so a leading voice on resilience and parenting, school climate, workplace, leadership. There's a lot of places we could start this conversation today. Bob, I'm so happy to see you. We at Worldmaker have personally benefited from our time with you as a faculty for an annual Resilience Summit. So I know your wisdom, your insights, your humor, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for having me, Molly. I'm looking forward to it also.
So, as I said, there's so many places we could start the conversation. Let's start with some what we call core shared human needs. And that first one being safety, not just physical safety, but psychological safety. What do you want our listeners to understand about psychological safety?
Well, it's interesting. I first became interested in psychological safety reading actually studies about the workplace where they talked a lot about psychological safety. But it has to do with any environment. For me, psychological safety implies that there's a certain respect among people, that a person could voice his or her opinions, that they do not feel that they are in danger in that environment. And if it's a child, the child feels that if certain adversity arises, that there are loving adults and very encouraging adults who will step in if necessary. It's hard for a person to develop resilience, as we'll get into more, if they are fearful, if they worry more about being attacked than about thriving and growing. And we see a number of kids. One of the toughest jobs I ever had, positions, was as principal of a school in a psychiatric hospital. And one of the things we had to provide was psychological safety for many kids who had been abused, but within a locked door psychiatric hospital. And we really had to learn then, what are the things we can do so that these children will feel safe, having not felt safe before. And when a lot of these kids, when they didn't feel safe before, the way they showed it was just to act out and to really rail against the environment in which they were.
And a key part of that, helping kids feel safe, I believe I use the word trusted adults from research, you use charismatic adults also from research. We're saying the same thing. Like, talk about the importance of those relationships in helping build resilience in children.
When I first became interested in resilience, like 40 years ago now, it's hard to believe, I started looking at, well, what is a basic foundation? And I shouldn't have been surprised. In research done by Emmy Werner and Michael Rudder, some of the giants in the field of resilience, when they interviewed adults who had faced great adversity and said, we could have never predicted, based on how you were as a child, that you would be as hopeful and as optimistic as you are today. What do you think was one of the most important things in that childhood to help you to be resilient? Well, in almost every study, the first answer was the same. And I think in a very spiritual way, it's why we're all here. The first answer, there was at least one adult along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. And the word charismatic adult actually comes from one of my heroes in the field of psychology who died probably about now 25 years ago. His name was Julius Siegel. He was a psychologist in Washington, D.C., and he wrote this short 3-page article back in the 1980s where he said, in research conducted around the world about children of misfortune, the ones who make it have during their childhood or adolescence the presence of what he called a charismatic adult. And now I must admit, sometimes I almost wish he hadn't used the word charismatic because it seems to have different meanings to different people. But Molly, the definition I love, an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And I might add, I get this question a lot, even as adults, we need charismatic adults in our lives. It's throughout our lifespan. So a basic foundation for me of resilience is that charismatic adult. Hopefully there are many, and hopefully throughout our lifespan. But that's why in my clinical practice, I started asking, who do you turn to if you're having a problem? And then I'll just mention this, hopefully we can get into it. As you grow and develop, not only do you need charismatic adults in your life, but in terms of meaning and purpose in our lives, we have to start serving as a charismatic adult for others. And so having charismatic adults and then serving as a charismatic adults for others are key dimensions of resilience across the lifespan.
Absolutely. Yeah, we also get that question. We used to call them trusted adults, and the
Right.
adults would be like, well, do I need one too? Do I get one too? So we started calling them trusted relationships.
Oh,
And,
that's
and we
great.
need these, right? From our youngest years all the way through lives. Let's go there with purpose. Talk more about, because it's another core shared human need. We all have this need for purpose.
Yes. I'll tell you where it started. I'll try to be very succinct on this because I could spend hours. When one of my first books was on school climate, almost like psychological safety, how do you create a school where kids will learn and feel safe? And in writing that book, I decided to do this really almost informal research. I gave a questionnaire out to 1,500 adults and then eventually 2,500. And the first question was, of all the memories you have of school, what is one of your favorite memories? Something an adult said or did that boosted your, and I use words like this, your dignity, your motivation, your learning. And I knew I would get things about even brief comments that someone would make, a teacher to a child. But what I didn't expect, and what was really going to tie to purpose and meaning, was a number of the most positive memories was when you were asked to help out. Somewhere as simple as, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straws. I remember when a teacher asked me to tutor a younger child. And still being somewhat naive about it, I said, that's one of your favorite memories of school as I'm reading this. Now we know, not just in children, throughout our senior years, that one of the things that lessens stress, one of the things that helps us to be more optimistic is the sense of purpose. That just helping in some small way. There's research to show volunteering an hour a week can make the world of difference. And one of the things I discovered, especially working with many challenging students, is if a child goes to school and feels that there's at least one thing he or she does at the school to improve the school, they are going to be much more motivated to be in that school, and they are less likely to be a discipline problem. Much research on that.
Mm-hmm. So let's tease this apart a little bit, because we're talking about purpose and meaningful contribution. And you also talked about learning and growth. And I see an additional need, at least I tease those apart, with that need for competence, right? That need for learning and growth, whether you call it mastery or agency, to get to a point where you feel good about something and you feel useful. Do you see that?
Yes. Oh, it's critical. A big mistake I made as a beginning therapist is I thought when I met with parents, especially working with kids, when I met with their parents or teachers, I thought it was important for me to find out what they saw as the kids' problems and then, quotes, fix it. It was the old deficit model. And I was getting depressed after these meetings. And then I had this epiphany, again, about 40 years ago. A lot changed for me at that point. I said, what would happen if after just 10, 15 minutes, I was to interrupt the parents or the teacher and say, now that I've heard about some of this child's problems, could you please tell me what you see? And I use words like this, their beauty, their strengths. And about 40 years ago, I coined the term, their islands of competence. It changed my whole approach. It was intriguing to me how when you shifted just a little, it was like much more than a little to many people, that we started getting a view of the entire child, a greater sense of hope emerged, because a child should not be defined just by their problems, but by their strengths as well. And years later, looking at some of the brain research, like by Richard Davidson, who found when you create positive emotions, that it actually helps kids and adults to be better problem solvers, more self-disciplined. Looking back 40 years ago, I said, by asking about strengths, I think it was creating positive emotions, and teachers and parents became much more willing to try different strategies. I think they were more hopeful. And then I started asking kids and adults, not just parents, what they saw as their islands of competence, because I wanted to build upon them. So what you just brought up, it's hard to be resilient if you feel you don't have any competencies in the world. And it's hard to be resilient if those competencies, or what everyone wants to call it, are not respected and honored by the adults in your life. So it became a major concept for me. I remember in the 80s would give this workshop called something like the search for islands of competence. It was almost like, an adventure story, but in some sense, it's what I experienced in doing this work and interviewing people about theirs or their children's islands of competence.
Yeah, and you make the point, again, this goes through our lifespan, I think, but that point that you were an early strength spotter, Bob, is what you were, right? You're a pioneer in that. And that's what we call people who look for and identify those strengths and mirror them back. But it's so true that as we do this, we then create energy. You talked about how they had more hope, they were more positive. You create more energy to then tend to what needs to be repaired or healed.
That's a wonderful point, because I often have said, and I emphasize this, is that when you look for islands of competence, it doesn't mean you ignore the problems, but it's easier to face the problems when a person feels that their strengths are also being acknowledged.
Yeah. All right. So there's one biggie we haven't touched yet when we talk about core human needs, belonging. Talk about the need for human connection.
Oh, I think it really ties to the charismatic adults. I think it is just critical. And this is at any age. Again, I keep saying this, but one of my favorite workshops I've given is resilience across the lifespan, starting with infancy throughout senior years. For me, it's difficult to think of someone being resilient without the presence of connections with other people, belonging. I talk a lot about that with teachers. Does every child in your class feel that they are welcome here, that they belong here? I think about it when I ran that school in a psychiatric hospital. Even though the kids didn't want to be here at first, I would ask, how can I create an environment where at least they felt they belonged in some way, even though most would just say this is I won't use the expletive, but a prison here. And I think it's in any relationship that resilience is born out of the connections we have. And that's why during the pandemic, especially the first month and a half of the pandemic, a lot of questions I got from teachers was, how can you have a sense of belonging on a screen, when they started doing Zoom calls? And we got into some interesting things of having a homeroom every day for, even 10 minutes to greet the kids, how are things going, asking the kids for feedback. But when you feel you don't belong, I think what happens is you either get very angry, you withdraw, you don't want to be in that environment. And that's true whether it's a school or I've consulted a number of businesses in a work environment. If you don't feel you're respected in a work environment, your work is not going to be as effective as it could be. So it's critical, I think, that concept.
Excellent. So some really important places to start with that belonging and that connectedness with trusted relationships, that sense of competence and purpose, and where we started with psychological safety. Stay more, we're going to get into resilient leadership when we come back.
Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At Mediacom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared. And you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
I don't remember how it started.
Go to that.
Oh boy. Our back and forth. It always came back. Dad! You probably don't remember what you told me.
That was perfect.
But I heard every word.
If I could go back and change it all, I would. I think I'm gonna miss you the most. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Maybe it's just the little moments. If I could go back and change it all, if I could go back, I would. But I can't.
Welcome back to Resiliency Matters. We are speaking with Dr. Robert Brooks, a clinical psychologist and author. And Bob, you have, as I said, author and co-author of 19 books. You have much hard-earned wisdom. So I'm going to put you through a bit of a lightning round.
Okay.
And just challenge you to answer, one or two sentences, but tight answers to complete these sentences. You game?
Yeah, my anxiety went up, but I'm game.
Do we need to breathe first?
Go ahead.
Okay. One of the most important lessons I've learned about nurturing resilience in myself is
that I really have to adopt what I call personal control, focus on what I have control over rather than trying to change things over which I have very little control.
Good tool. Okay, one of the most important lessons I've heard or learned about nurturing resilience in children is
one of the first things is to be empathic and to ask ourselves questions like, how would I hope my children, what words do I hope my children would use to describe me? What do I intentionally say or do so they're likely to use these words? And if I ask them, would they be likely to use the words I hope they would use? That helps us to think about that every time we interact with a child, they form images of us that are going to play a major role in whether or not we serve as a charismatic adult for them.
We're going to circle back to that one, but I'm going to do a couple more lightning rounds. One of the most important lessons I've learned about nurturing resilience in colleagues or other adults, and maybe after crisis, is
one of the most important things is to validate first what they say. I think it becomes very easy, and I've heard this from adults, for people to say everything will be okay, don't worry about it. Instead, I found it's very important to be able to say, I'm glad you could share this with me or talk to me about this. It has been a very painful experience. And then turn it into problem solving, maybe together, whatever help I can be. To, with this, whatever the issue may be, I'm here for you. So you validate, you don't lessen in any way what they've gone through, and you really keep the door open in terms of their feeling they can approach you. And then you could discuss whatever the crisis might have been.
Yeah. Yes. And then one final one. One of the most important lessons I've learned about resilient leadership, effective leadership, is
a couple quick things. One is empathy. Daniel Goleman talked a lot about that as part of emotional intelligence. When I speak with leaders, I'll always ask them the same questions I mentioned before. How do you hope the people reporting to you describe you? What words do you hope they use? And what do you intentionally say or do so they're likely to use these words? So a person could have, just a greater impact on those who report to him or her. And the other, it may sound, again, somewhat simple, is for leaders, I shouldn't say simple, but people don't think this way. I wrote a couple of articles on the power of kindness in fostering effective leadership. You saw my little pause, because some people say, well, isn't everyone kind? And I said, no, there's actually a lot of research showing that when leaders actually practice a certain level of kindness, it really creates that psychological safety we talked about earlier.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research coming out on kindness. And part of that intrigues me is that as the givers of the kindness, we underestimate the impact. We underestimate what a difference it does make to others.
That's been I hope I'm not interrupting. That has been a fascinating finding in some of the recent research or within the last decade. We do often underestimate how a kind word or gesture to someone else, the impact it has on that person. And so we minimize what we think we can do. And the more research comes out that even a simple comment, a gesture of kindness will be remembered for the other person's entire life, helps us to realize the impact of what nowadays people call micro moments, these brief moments that in which you really enhance or enrich the life of another person.
Yeah. So circle back. I'm interested when you're talking about kids and helping them paint that picture in their mind. Are you talking about making sure you're communicating with that level of vocabulary or that understanding is achieved, or is there something else I'm missing there?
Oh, no, excuse me, not at all. when I started asking those questions, like how would you hope your children or your students, what words do you hope they would use to describe you? A lot of teachers and parents said those kind of questions were very helpful to them, to remind them that any word could really have a major impact on their, on their life. But it could be almost anything. I think what it does in terms of question, it gets people to, without paralyzing them so they're thinking every word they use, to recognize that as they interact with their kids or their staff or whatever, that they are forming powerful images in the minds of those people. And, I'll give you a very quick example because I know about time. One time a principal asked me to consult at his school and I was at a staff meeting. And he said he feels he's disengaged from the faculty or they're disengaged from him. And a faculty member, this young woman, said, I'm having trouble managing a couple of kids in my classroom. I think she had the courage to say it, maybe because I was there, I have no idea. The principal, thinking he was being helpful, said, maybe if you took more courses in how to manage kids, it wouldn't be as difficult. He was very well-meaning, but afterwards he said, it didn't seem to work. I said, because you didn't validate. If you would have said to her something like, I'm so glad that you could bring this up because all of us at times have had trouble managing kids, maybe as a staff, and always turned into problem solving. Maybe as a staff, we can figure out how we help each other. Rather than immediately saying, go read another book. Again, it may seem simple. This was a wonderful principle, but he right away wanted to solve the problem rather than validating and normalizing what this teacher was going through, that many people do, in fact, as teachers, have trouble managing a few kids. So I started getting very nitty-gritty about the specific words we use. It didn't have to be the exact words I use, but to validate first. And I've often said, Molly, that resilient people see problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. And that's why so many of the things, the interventions have to do with how do you engage people in solving problems with you where they know you're going to be of help.
But not jumping into that problem solving and, let me fix that for you. But starting with that open-ended questions, that reflection back, that affirming, that affirmation you're talking about.
And it's very easy as a parent or even a therapist to sometimes jump into quickly. Yeah. And then you realize you're really robbing the person of really finding out for themselves how capable they are.
So you've mentioned empathy a couple of times, and I want to get your take on that as such an essential skill in building resilience, and also this need for boundaries. We hear a lot of helpers. We help the helpers at Worldmaker, and so we hear helpers saying, "Yeah, I get it. Like I need boundaries, and they serve me, but I'm just so empathetic. I have a hard time." So what's your take on that?
Well, I'm just going to talk the way I do. When people, I've heard this in many ways. I've heard parents say, if I'm too empathic, my kids will take advantage of me. I've heard with leaders, if I'm too empathic, I'll be taken advantage of. And so I wanted to just stress, like when I tell parents, the most empathic parents I have found are the best disciplinarians, because they're always asking, how do I discipline my children in a way where they will become more responsible and respectful and resilient rather than more angry and resentful? So the other thing is, people have said, and there is something called, basically where you burn out being too empathic. But I have always felt that sometimes when you over-identify, there's a difference between putting yourself in the shoes of another person and over-identifying with them so that you're really almost in the same skin with them in that regard. So, empathic people are the ones, now this is just me, other people may argue, empathic people are the ones who have a better sense of how to set boundaries, because they're being able to put themselves in the shoes of another person, but they keep themselves separate. They're not over-identifying with this other person. And I know all of this can sound very technical. My feeling is we have to know that there are certain things as parents or as teachers or as therapists, or just in our daily lives, that there's certain things we could try to understand another person. We can be compassionate and help another person. But it's very important to still know who we are and not assume how another person feels because we feel that way. And I know some of this is somewhat abstract, but for me, it's very important. Empathy is such a vital skill, but it is different from sympathy. It's different from over-identification, where you're almost taking on this other person's personality.
So it's almost more about going within and connecting to your own experience so that you can better connect with the experience, but not take on the experience of another.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too abstract, because it could get very complex there, but it's important to think about, can I communicate? I'm attempting to understand your world, but if the boundaries are lost, then you're not going to be able to really assist that other person if they're having a great deal of difficulty. Yeah,
and I think there's a gem in there when you say that you found the best disciplinarians as parents are the most empathetic, right? Discipline as meaning to teach, right?
Exactly.
To guide, to be, and the same in the workplace, right? To it might be called accountability or something else, but you know, is there a punitive piece of that, or is it holding people account to the organization's mission or the leader's intent or the best version of themselves, right? So it's empathy runs through those processes.
Definitely.
Okay. I know our time would go quickly. I want to get back. We recently reconnected around some writing we each were doing on awe. And so I want you to bring that forth.
Okay. Yeah, that's how it was great to reconnect over that. I've written a couple of articles for my website. I know one was very recent, and you had written something about it. I said, oh, I got to contact Mollie about this. And what's really intriguing me about awe, you know, originally I thought when you ask people about awe, and some of the research showed this, they would say, oh, the first time I saw the Grand Canyon, or the first time, whatever it may have been, something really so stupendous. But the recent research is even more intriguing and worthwhile for me, is awe could be as simple. And in that article, I actually had a photo of me holding my first grandchild when she was like 2 days old, and it was total awe. And when I held my own kids, or I think I gave an example when I was walking a certain route in my hometown, seeing a house go up so quickly by these very skilled workmen and workwomen, because I'm not handy at all. But what was fascinating then also is the research showing what awe does, that it really activates parts of the brain that help you to be more self-disciplined, that help you to be calmer. And so there are these brief experiences, they may be very brief, with those micro moments again, that actually are so therapeutic in a way. You could see awe anywhere. And it doesn't have to be something great like the Grand Canyon. Sometimes we don't appreciate some of the littlest things there. And I know we just have a little time, so I'll let you jump in again, because I remember I'm connecting about the topic of awe.
Yeah. And I love that point. Let's leave it with that, where it's wonderful if you travel around the world. I believe in travel and multicultural interactions, but you can experience this awe in your hometown. So Thank you, Bob, for joining us today. And thank you, viewers, for joining us on Media Comments U22, your local programming leader.